if you've got this kind of group that you're trying to tease apart and analyze, and you're like, well, I'm going to give, employee D feedback, but through employee A, B, and C, you're resting on a lot of assumptions that A, B, and C are good behavior change agents themselves, I guess. So that must be like a very complicated process.
Yeah. Well, it's actually not super I'll just talk about my own organization. It's interesting. Shannon might have a different opinion because I'm the internal OBM person, which I guess maybe we should spend a second on, and she's the external OBM person. So there's two different ways you can do this job. I'm the chief operating officer of a fairly large human service company. So I'm a behavior analyst. I was a clinical behavior analyst as well, but I oversee the organization. All the vice presidents and directors report to me. Shannon probably can talk about her experience as an entrepreneur and coaching manager. So it's different, but I'll answer your question in that what I always say is anybody's welcome to come to Phase-In, which is where I work. Anytime they want and take a look, they can look at the secret sauce. You can take notes. You can do whatever you want to do. You want to copy everything that I do and go back, because it's not complicated, but it's very hard. So I don't ever worry about somebody coming in and stealing my recipe, because even if they got the recipe like without a lot of experience or coaching from Shannon or Josh or somebody, they're going to go back to their company and I'm not going to be able to do, because it's really hard to make all this stuff happen. But it's actually not that complicated. I say these things and just I have a good system in place and things, well, most of the time. And then things like carry on and they just trickle down, and I'm pretty confident it's going to happen. And it does, but I engineered it that way. It didn't happen by accident. I think a lot of companies make that mistake a lot, which is Byron, I think kind of what you were getting at. You assume you tell your manager and they are going to tell it, and all these things are going to happen. It's like, but if you haven't programmed for it, just like in clinical work, that's not going to happen. There's no way that it's going to click down where you need it to.
Yeah, and I think my role as an external consultant, I end up working pretty often as the organization gets larger. So as there becomes, more disconnect between, say, the owner, and then there's a clinical director, and then there's the BCBAs, then there's the BCABAs, and then there's the technicians, if you've got that type of structure. In those types of organizations, I actually tend to do multi-level coaching, where I will work with the owner of the company probably once or twice a month, but then I'm working with a lot more of those mid-level managers a little bit more frequently to get their skills up. And the skills that I work on with that owner are very different than the skills that I work on with those mid-level managers. So that's a lot of the kind of structure that I've taken with some of my clients. With the smaller companies where there's like a clinical director who is also the owner, and then BCBAs, I tend to just work with that clinical director and get them to do kind of a train the practitioner model, where I'll teach them the skills that they need, say, to deliver good feedback, as an example. So I'll teach the clinical director / owner good feedback delivery skills, get them fluent, and then I'll have them train all of their staff to also do that and teach them how to assess that they're ready to go off and do that on their own. So that does take a lot more work. And like Byron's mentioning, because he's got more control over the system and more eyes on it, it's a lot easier to implement as an internal. I wouldn't say a lot easier, marginally easier to implement as an internal OBM practitioner than me coming in as a complete stranger to the organization. If that makes sense.
Yeah, they have to do what I say.
I hold no contingencies. That's the problem.
Yeah, I think that's a big difference when you're considering internal, external consulting. And I've dabbled in both. I own companies that are clinics, schools, so I can hire and fire, which means that I hold some contingency control there. And then I've also consulted with other organizations, variety of types of organizations. The other thing I'd point out that might be an interesting, maybe a turn or pivot. There's sort of two fields of thought in OBM in terms of how to approach. One is more focused on behavior, and one's more focused on product or output. Mm-hmm. And so you've got sort of if you had to slice them, Gilbertsonian output performance-based approach versus, contemporary now would be, Carl Binder and performance thinking. And then you've got the more the more behavioral. So the focus is how do we change behavior in that organization and hope that's aligned with and yields us the outputs we want. And those are may sound semantic, but it's actually a pretty big difference in how you approach things. I prefer the former in terms of I think that thought process will help. It kind of, the reason I brought up it impacts how all members of the team think about situations. A good example would be if I've got a business owner that is unhappy with their maybe executive team's performance, and they say, I don't like it. What they're likely to do that we see often is called kind of micromanaging. They get in and they start to try to push behavior around. And I just saw this happen at one place that a time clock popped up. And it was, we're paying X dollars and we should get our money's worth, was kind of this, how to figure out what to do about, I'm unhappy with performance. And without understanding from a behavior systems approach, what that's going to focus the team on. And that's going to focus the team on being there at a time and exiting at a time, and not on any it literally doesn't change any outcomes except for people in the building. So if that were an outcome, but that doesn't solve the problem at all. In fact, it kind of makes it worse, because then they're there early and hanging around versus, what really, as we kind of dug in, as we're talking to the various levels, the problem was it wasn't really clear what the expectations were. There weren't ways to post accomplishments up. And so things that were getting done weren't visible across the board. And so I think that I've had several times of situations of that, it's like, oh, you're kind of thinking of it as a behavior problem. And it really sounds more of a performance and output issue. So your consulting and if you're internal, the way you think about it will drive different types of OBM technologies in there, I think.
That was perfect. Thanks. I feel like that 5 minutes just spoke to a bunch of us who work in behavioral clinics or centers and are just like, oh, right. We totally misunderstood the target on that one.